Well, now in our garden, it's time for us to go in and thin out our beets. We planted them, of course, pretty close, and we need to thin them so the root part will size up on us. And you know, beets are one of those vegetables that people either love to eat or hate. And I'm one of the latter. I really don't care for beets, but that's because I've always thought that the only part you could eat was the bottom part, the root part. But we're going to go into the kitchen with Barb Brown, and she's going to show us a recipe on using beet tops. Well, we had a lot of beets that we thinned out, and Barb, probably the most frustrating thing on eating beets is really just trying to get them cleaned up. How do you suggest that we prepare them to use them in a meal?
Well, for the kind that we're doing when we're thinning, we're going to do it a little bit different than we would with mature beets. With mature beets, you cut it off, leaving about 1 to 2 inches of the stem is all, and then go from there. We made sure that we washed them well in several changes of water to make sure that we got all the grit and dirt and sand off. One of the things you need to focus on primarily is this part down around here, because we're going to eat the entire beet rather than throw it away and just use the greens. These are very young, very tender, and we can eat the stems and the small beets too, as long as they're about marble size. There's sometimes some dead leaves and stems down here you need to pull off and then get all the grit too. The next stage is simply to get it into a size that's manageable in your pan. So we're going to do a couple of cuts here, one on the tops of the greens, and then we're going to cut it again a little bit further down, and so that we can fit it in the pan. Now the part with the marble beets on them, or the marble size beets, we're going to put in the bottom of the pan, and we're going to add around 1/4 to 1/2 cup of water, depending on the size of your pan. So that there's enough water that they won't scorch. And then just put the tops on top of that so that they will steam while the beets themselves are in the boiling water.
And that's because they take the longest amount of time to cook.
That's exactly right. Now we'll then put a lid on the pan. Again, these are green, so they're going to compress, but we need to start with a big pan to get as many as possible in there. We then are going to put those on heat, bring it to a boil, and let them boil for 10 to 15 minutes. They'll be done when the beets bulbs themselves are tender, so that's what you'll check for doneness.
Okay.
After about 10 minutes, we'll test them to make sure that they're tender enough by either sticking with a knife or a fork. And once that's done and they're tender enough, then you can go ahead and drain them. You need to take a little bit of caution when draining beets, whether it's beet greens or whatever, because there will be some red dye to them that we use for natural dye, actually, that can dye your clothes as well and may not come out. We don't want to press these too hard, even though they're greens, because you'll squash the beet itself, so we want to leave those intact. One of the things a lot of people do with beets is either add a lot of sugar or a lot of fat to them. They use, with greens in particular, they'll use bacon grease and bacon and so on. We're going to add a little bit of margarine to this. I think probably one of these will be sufficient just to add a little bit of flavor. Then salt and pepper is probably all you'd need to add to make these taste really good.
Well, now, Barb, we use the entire beet here, but, you know, we mentioned the beet root and everything. Once they're cutting the tops off, we can still use those for greens
right,
as well,
once they're mature. You want to make sure that they aren't too mature and dried out and so on. Also, they're high in, they have some oxalic acid the same way rhubarb tops do. So it's not as much as rhubarb, so it's not a toxic problem, but you can't count on them for being a good source of calcium or iron.
Okay. Well, a few good tips again, and once you're out thinning your beets, remember you can use the entire plant or the tops as greens as well. Thanks again, Barb.
You're welcome.